Hey guys, what's going on? So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to make your own very own custom URL shortener application using Django. And so as you can see, some of the technologies I've used on the bottom here, Django, Python, and Bootstrap. And the way this works is very similar to something like if you've used Bitly or something like TinyURL, where you take some kind of a long URL, you put it in here and you shorten it, and it gives you back a small URL. So let's go ahead and demo it. Let me show you how this works. So if I had a website, say for example like HTTP, and I put in apple.com, what it's going to do is it's going to say, congratulations, I've got a shortened URL. Now what would happen if you were to deploy this into production? Right now this is on my local server, but if you were to deploy this in production, you can actually have your own URL here. So you can have something like, awesomeurl.com or whatever you want as your URL over here. Then you'd have your shortened path following after that. And this is randomly generated and it's written to a database, which we'll show you how to do as well. So now if I were to go ahead and put this into a browser, let's just go ahead and test this out. If I went here and I put this in a browser, it takes me right to apple.com, which is perfect. Now what happens if I try to go ahead and put apple.com in here again? So if I went to HTTP and I went to apple.com, it's actually going to say now the record or exist, and it gives you the URL, the shortened URL. Just for fun, let's try something else right now. HTTP, and I'll go to amazon.com. And so it gives me the shortened URL for Amazon. So we're going to copy and paste that, and we're going to put it into a new tab and put it in here, and it directs me to amazon.com, which is exactly what we want. So that's basically how this service works. And I put this website together. Most of these links are dead here, other than the home link, but I just put it for demonstration purposes really. And most of this, to be honest, was put together in a very, very few short number of hours. But I'm going to show you how to build this from start to finish, including the backend. We'll walk through the code, and we'll walk through a whole bunch of other things. In terms of the lesson plan and what I want to accomplish, I'm just going to bring this over. Rather than animating this, I'm just going to talk through it really. We're going to go ahead and walk through how to install Django, some of the dependencies we need for this in a virtual environment. We're going to talk about setting up Django itself with some of the migrations we need to do. We're going to walk through the logic code, which is sitting in views.py. We'll go over data storage with SQLite 3. This uses something called ORM, which we'll cover later on. And then we're going to set up an HTML form, and we're going to use Bootstrap. And this is the HTML form, basically. And we're going to figure out how we're going to retrieve data and how we're going to query data. And then we're going to just demo it all over again once we built it. So that is basically the lesson plan. Now, one other thing that I want to caution you guys on is the last time I did a video on Django, which I'm going to link above, I had split it out into about 5 or 6 different parts. I can't remember. And although it actually got really good feedback, there's a lot of people that said that they learned a lot from it. One of the feedback that they gave me was, you have it in 6 different videos, and sometimes it's hard to follow because for whatever reason the playlist didn't jive at first. So I've decided to make this one really long, massive video that you guys can pause, stop, go back, refresh, do whatever you need to do. But I figured if I put everything in one video, I'll put the code up on GitHub as well, and I'll put the requirements.txt file on GitHub as well. There's a lot of people that reached out that also said, hey, the dependencies aren't working for me, and that's because they never used a requirements.txt. So you need to do that. You need to set it up in a virtual environment, use requirements.txt, and it'll work just fine. So let's go ahead with point number 1, and let's go ahead and install a virtual environment and set up Django. And I also want to take this opportunity to talk about Levers.ai. What Levers.ai is, it provides a skills gap for people within organizations or people that may be displaced in capabilities that are upcoming in the future, like AI, machine learning, and software development. Approximately 800 million jobs that are going to be displaced, in which case there's going to be a lot of upskilling that's going to be required. And if you want to get ahead of the curve and learn a little bit more about some upskilling possibilities, check out Levers.ai. All right, so I already have everything set up in this one directory over here. So this is my Django video file directory over here. Let me just full screen this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a separate virtual directory right here, a separate venv basically. I'll call it something else, just so that you guys can walk through how this is set up. If you go through the venv file, if you go through the URL shortener project, which is my Django project, I have my requirements.txt, which I'll show you how to generate. I have my application, I have my overall project, I have my database, which everything is written to. So if I were to just go ahead and open this and show you very quickly, when we just put in Amazon and so forth, those are basically here. And I'm going to show you how I've done this in terms of logic. You'll notice that I actually don't have the full URL here. And that was strategically done for a few reasons. One is I don't want to be storing long different versions of URLs. It just doesn't make sense. And the second thing is, from a storage perspective, I'm using way less space if I code it or encode it into some kind of a numerical number and then decode it when I need to, using the short URL string, which basically will go ahead and query this, and this will convert it back into the full URL. And that's basically how this works. But we'll cover that more when we get into the actual logic of it as well. So let's go ahead and create a new virtual environment. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a terminal file. I'm going to close down what I was in. We're going to clear this, and let me just make this bigger so we can all follow through. Now, currently I'm in this folder, I believe. Let me just double check. Yep, we're going to go out one. So pretend this is your folder wherever you're going to do your project, wherever you're going to do your work. This is that folder. And right in this folder, we're going to create a brand new virtual environment. And in order to do that, you're going to type in virtual env. We'll call it venv2. I'm going to specify that I want it to be Python 3. So I believe right now I'm using Python 3.7, and that's what it's going to install. But we can check that. And I made a mistake here, and that is this is not supposed to have a hyphen. It's just virtual venv2. And then this is basically saying the version of Python that I want to install. Once I do that, you notice it created a venv directory above here. So now that's done, what we need to do is we need to go ahead and log into this virtual environment. So we're going to type in source venv2 bin activate. And of course I didn't spell venv properly. This happens sometimes. And now you'll notice that I'm actually in the virtual directory because it's got that venv in the brackets. So I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen so that we have some more real estate to work with. And now I'm going to start installing some dependencies. So here's the dependencies you're going to need. You're going to need pip install Django. So we'll go ahead and install that. All right, so once that's done, the next thing we're going to go ahead and install is the Django REST framework. So pip install Django REST framework. And again, all of this will be there in the requirements.txt. You can just run the requirements.txt file and it'll install all of this. And I'll show you how to do that very soon. You're also going to need pip install Django bootstrap 4. And this is so that when we render our HTML file, we actually have a bootstrap file associated with it. We're also going to install pip install Django crispy forms. And that just gives a nice touch and feel to the actual form. And that's all you need for now, I believe. If we need something else, we will. If I had my requirements.txt, so I'm going to show you how to create a requirements.txt. You're going to do pip freeze, and then you're going to do pipe requirements.txt. And now when I go ahead and look, I do an ls, it's going to have requirements.txt in here. And if I wanted to install requirements.txt rather than typing all of this, I would just do pip install requirements.txt. And I believe I'm missing an R. And that's it. So it'll go through everything and it'll recursively go ahead and install all of this stuff. So that covers point number 1, which was installing Django and the dependencies. So I'll go ahead and italicize that, and I don't know, maybe change the color for fun and say that's been done. Perfect. Now we want to set up Django and some of the initial migrations. So in order for us to do that, remember we are in our venv2 file. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create another project, because this is my original project right now. I'm going to create another project. I'll call it URL Shortener project 2, just for simplicity's sake here. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to first clear out of this, and in order to set up Django, Django's got this thing called Django admin. As soon as you run that, it's going to give you a whole bunch of things that you can go ahead and install and look at. What we first need to do is we need to start a project. So if you think about the hierarchy, you always start with a project, and under every project you're going to have different applications. You may have an application, for example, that is a mortgage application, something then that looks at real estate value, or in our case here, you may have an application that has a login functionality, another application that has the actual shortener functionality we're looking at. So applications are almost like small little microservices that are going to fall under the big initiative, or the big project in this case. So we're going to go ahead and start a new project. We'll call it Django admin start project, and then we'll just call it, we'll just call it URL project. Just keep it simple. There you go. So now I have a folder called URL project. I'm going to go ahead and cd into that URL project, and let's go ahead and open it up here as well. Now as I go into this URL project folder, the other thing I want to be able to do, again, ls, so we have a manage.py and we have a URL project. The other thing I want to be able to do now is I want to be able to create an application. So I'm going to go ahead and type in Django admin start app, and we'll just call it shortener. And now you notice that there's a folder here called shortener that's also in this project as well. And that's what we want. So if you go back, it should be your URL project, which is your ultimate folder. Then you have your URL project, which is your project, your main project. And then under this, you're going to have different applications. So if I started another application, it would open another project folder for that, and so forth. All right. And now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and test to see how this works. But before that, let me walk you through a little bit of the topology here of what we're going to be looking at. If you look at your project file, you have your init folder, or your init file, which is initialization file. It's empty pretty much. The only ones that you're going to be using really are models.py, views.py, and we're also going to have to bring in something called urls.py. So what I just do is, if I go to the main project here, URL project, the topology there is I've got the same init, ASGI. We're going to touch settings very soon. We're going to touch URLs. And because we're going to need another URLs in the shortener, I'll explain why in a second. As a matter of fact, I'm also going to link a video above, one of my 5th or 6th videos in my series, which talks about how this is structured. You can watch that if this doesn't make sense, or you can use both as a resource. But we're going to come back to this in a second. Let's go back to the original file. In the URL project, which again is your main project here, there's something called settings.py. So we're going to go ahead and open this with Sublime Text. And in settings.py, what you have to do is it has a whole bunch of different applications in here. So installed apps, it has, a whole bunch of stuff you don't have to worry about right now. We are going to be using some of these things like static files, messages. We will get to that in a second. But you also have to tell it that you just installed another application, which is called shortener. So if I go back here, I just need to go in here and type in exactly how I have it, shortener. And that's it. So this basically says that that folder shortener is now a part of this entire project. And so we've installed the application within the main project, and that's what you want to do. There's a few other things we're going to have to finagle around in here, and I'll get to that later in the end, especially when we start using images in a deployment or development stage. When you get into production, it's a little bit easier, but we'll walk through development for now. But that's all we're going to do right now with the settings.py. So I'm going to sort of just close that for now. Now, if I go back to my main folder and I now go to urls.py, here's the way this works. So when I go to my website, which is my main site here, and this is going to be my URL shortener, it's going to go to the URLs py for the project. And now the project needs to determine, based on what the person wants, which application do I send this URL to. And let's say that they want to go ahead and do the URL shortener, for example. So then they would say, okay, I'm going to send them to the shortener application, pardon my writing here, which has its own urls.py. And in that shortener application for that urls.py, if I go to something like /shorten, it's going to do one thing. If I go to /clear, it's going to do another thing. If I go to /retrieve, it's going to do another thing. And the same thing could be said for different applications here. So if site URL, if shortener is one of the applications I have, let's say the other application I have is sign up for a domain name if that URL doesn't exist. I'm just making stuff up here. So then you would go to a sign up application, and in sign up it would have things like register. So this is its own URLs.py. It'd have things like register. It'd have things like who is. It'd have things like check prices or something like that. But at the end of the day, you have some main website, which is the main URLs.py, and it will direct it then based on whatever / you put in. So this could be / URL shortener or something like that. This could be / register domain or something like that. And then based on that, it'll send it to its own URLs, and it just keeps routing itself until it hits whatever you want to do. So that's how URLs.py works. And it's important for you to understand that, because we're going to go through both URL files very quickly, and it may get somewhat confusing because you may say, well, why do we have 2 URLs files? And that's just because we're going to have, in reality, you would have multiple applications that are sitting on a project, and for that reason, you're going to want to have different URLs.py files. So now that we have a little bit of a briefing about that, let's go through the URLs.py file that is in the, I believe I just opened the one that was in the projects just because I duplicated both of them. Just want to make sure this is the right one. So you can get rid of all of this stuff. This is just commenting. I find it distracting personally. But what I do in this case is there's a few things. One is you have to first of all import your Python folder into this. Now I'm going to write this in for now. This is going to make a whole lot of sense a little bit later on, but let me just back out of this and go here. And what you want to do is you want to be able to add in this folder into this URLs.py so that any single time that I'm going to be hitting a certain command, it knows to go to that folder or to that application. So we're going to say from shortener, because that's what it's called, import views, and we'll go over what that is in a second. And then we're just going to say from dot import settings as well, because this URLs.py file is sitting in this project folder, which is right here, and settings is in the same folder, which is why I'm using that little dot command that basically says look in the existing folder. And now when you go to our website, so let's go ahead and start up our website just to give you some context to how this works. So let's go ahead and quickly just start it up. We're going to go and type in, so let me just make sure, we're going to type in Python manage.py run server, and we'll put it on port 8000. Now, I purposely did this because I know I haven't ran migrations, and remember when I went back to my thing here, I said that we also have to run migrations, but I'm going to explain what that is in a second. So I can actually go to this URL right now and it should be operational. Let's give it a shot. So let me bring over my original one here, and we're going to rewrite this over with port 8000, and you'll see that Django is in fact working, which is good. So we have a working instance of Django. Having said that, there's a whole bunch of settings that I'm going to be changing. You know, what I put in my URLs, what I put in my settings.py, and a whole bunch of other things that need to get migrated. And in order for you to do that, it basically says over here, Python manage.py migrate. So we're going to go ahead and type this command in after closing this in. And it's basically initialize my database. So now when I go back here, you'll notice that I actually have a database here as well. So if I just open this database up, and there's a cool application called DB Browser SQLite. It's free. You can check it out. But basically this creates all of your different authentication, your Django admin logs, your migration sessions, all that other kind of stuff. So this is the necessary stuff you need. So now if I were to go ahead and run manage.py or run server again, you're going to notice I don't have that error anymore. Anytime you change your code, especially your models.py, you're going to have to go ahead and change that, because models.py is what we're going to be using to define how we want to set up our database in the background, or a database table in this case in the background. The database has already been set up. Now there's one other thing I need you to see here, and that is the reason why I wanted to show you this /admin. When I go ahead and do this Django.py, now I go to /admin. This is taking me, remember, to my main page. It's actually taking me to an administration, a backend where I can go ahead and log in. But I don't have a username and password yet. So we need to go ahead and create one. And for that reason, we're going to log out of this. So for that, I need to go ahead and create a super user. So I'm going to type in Python manage.py create super user. It's going to ask me for a name. I'm just going to put in sats. It's asked me for an email address, leave it blank. Password, I'll just put in test123, test123. Okay, so it's too common, so I'll just put in something else. I can bypass the validation. In this case, I'm just going to do that because we're developing for fun anyways here. And anyways, it's been done. At least it gives you that. I don't think it gave me that back when I tried it with Django 2. I'm running Django 3 right now. So this is good. So now let's go back and run that server again. We're going to go to run server. And now we're going to log in with these credentials. It's already over here, so we're going to type in sats test123. And no, don't need to do it. So now, if you notice, I actually have a backend, but I don't have a lot here. The other thing I want to be able to do is I want to be able to register my application. And what that means is I need my application to show up over here. But for the purpose of this video, I'm actually going to bypass us looking at how to register an application. We don't really need to do it for this. But I will put a link down below into one of my previous videos that shows you how to register the application. But for our purposes today, we don't really need it and we're not going to use it. So that's how that admin panel works. Now, what I also want to be able to tell this application to do is to go on, and when I say / shortener or something like that, I want to send it to the URL's py file that's in my shortener application. So to do that, we're going to type in path. We're going to type in, so if I basically go to the main page is what I'm saying. So if I don't type in admin, if I just go directly to the main page, I'm saying go ahead and we're going to type in include, and we're going to type in shortener.urls. And the other thing I need to do here up top is from Django.urls import path and also import include. And that basically will take care of this function. So this has not been created yet. We haven't done anything with it yet. This is more of a placeholder, but know that we are going to be needing this for developing things moving forward. And that should take care of the urls.py file for the actual main project. Now we're going to start working directly into the application itself. So here's what I'm going to do, just so I don't have to keep clicking back and forth. I'm just going to back out of this. I'm going to go to Sublime and I'm going to add this entire folder, URL projects right here. So now I don't have to sort of go back and forth. I can just pick and choose everything I want right on the side, which is what I probably should have done from the start, but that's okay. All right, so there's a few different types of file formats or files. We're going to have to develop models.py, urls.py, views.py, and we're going to have to add a couple more. But before I get into the application any further, I think it's important for us to go through the actual logic of how this actually is going to work. So let me just do a little pictorial here for you in terms of how this is going to work. When a user goes onto the website and they have a URL that they're going to put in www. If it's Amazon whatever.com, pretend that's full Amazon here. What happens after this point is we're going to decode this website. And what I mean by decode this website is we're going to convert this website into its own unique integer. And so every website, whether it's written as www.amazon.com, http.www.amazon.com, every string value on earth can actually be decoded into some kind of an integer. And this is the first field I want to store in my database, is I want to be able to store the integer, because if for whatever reason I need to retrieve this URL, I can just look up this integer, and storing an integer value is a lot more economical from a data storage standpoint than storing these large URLs, basically. So this is probably the better way to do it. So what happens is when I do this now, it's going to say store this into value 1, 2, 3. And when I look at my database, and so if I had to look at the way that I would set up my database, I would have something like just some kind of a ID value, which is just an auto increment, 1, 2, 3, some kind of an index or whatever you want to call it. Then I would have my my URL ID, which is this number. So 1, 2, 3 would get stored right there. And we'll walk through the database in a second. And then as this conversion happens, I have another function that will take this and one time only give it some kind of a unique alphanumeric character. So it'll be like, A1 small z b, and that's that thing after the URL, that little shortening piece that I was talking about. And I want to be able to store that as well. So if I want to call that my URL identifier or string or whatever we want to call it, it will store that. So it'll store, let's call it A small b big C small d or something like that. And that is all I'm storing in my database. So what happens in a scenario, I now have this entire database, and now I actually go into Google or Chrome or Safari or whatever, and I type in something like www.amazon.com, and then I put in /ABCD. Well, what's going to happen next? What it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, let's take this value, let's query that into the database, let's retrieve the URL ID, and then I have a separate function that's going to take the URL ID and it's going to encode the URL ID back to Amazon.com. So it'll take 1, 2, 3, and it's going to convert that back to Amazon.com. And you'll see in the views.py file, that is how the logic is set up, and we'll go through that in a sec. I've already pre-written the views file. It's too large for us to type today. I'll walk through the code, but I want you to understand this is basically how it works. So if I were to go ahead and pull up the views.py file, let's just go ahead and look at that right now very quickly. This is the way it looks. So, it may look a little intimidating, but the code's actually not that bad. A lot of this stuff is just standard. You just copy and paste it. Don't worry about it. You're going to need to do some things like serialize your data. We'll walk through all that in a second, but let's walk through the scenario that I just walked through right now. So what happens in a scenario where I'm going to convert my full URL to an ID? I have a function called base decode. In that, I'm going to take in my request, which is the actual URL, Amazon.com, and it'll take that URL and then it'll perform this logic, and it's going to return an ID. I'll let you walk through the logic yourselves. It's actually not very complex. And it's a very well documented common methodology of how to decode and encode a URL to an integer to a URL. And so this is a great way to do it, and you're always going to get the same unique ID. So it's not like you're going to generate a different ID every time. You're going to get the same ID, and vice versa. When it's time for me to go ahead and query that, I'm going to take that ID and I'm going to convert that back into an integer, and it's using this list that I've defined. Now, a lot of people would say, well, hang on, you've taken out all the capitals when I want to encode the URL back. And that's because if I go into Google and type in http:/amazon.com in caps, in title text, or in lowercase, I'm going to end up in the same place. So part of my logic down here somewhere, let me just find it here, is I've actually said whenever we're typing in the URL, just lowercase everything. So this way, when I'm storing it in my database, I just need to worry about lowercase text. I don't need to worry about everything. Remember, I have my service URL, which is set up as localhost 8002. That's the port that I opened on. But in reality, if you're putting this in production, this is where you would put something like http:/bit.ly or tinyurl.com or whatever your service is going to be called. And then that's what it does. Now, every single time I'm taking my URL and converting it to an ID, at the same time, I'm also creating a random shortener at the end. And that's that alphanumeric character that I was talking about. And that would be that thing that goes after your service ID. So if I type in / AEX, whatever that thing returns, that is what this function is doing. It's creating one time a random character. And some of you may be thinking, well, if it's creating a random character, well, your random characters change all the time. The other function that we have in here is it's called check ID. So it's never going to create another random character assuming that unique ID that we generated above here exists. So you're never going to have a scenario where you're going to have two of the exact same IDs with different endpoints, basically. Just because it checks the ID first. If it exists, then it's going to say record already exists. The link is so forth. If it doesn't exist, it's going to give you a congratulations message and you're good to go. And then this is your redirect function. So after I put in the shortened URL in Google, it's going to go ahead and use ORM in this case, which we'll walk through later on, to go ahead and query that ID. It's going to pass that ID into the encoding function, which the encoding function, remember, converts an ID to the full URL. And then finally, it will go ahead and redirect it to that full URL. And that's the way this works really. And then this is for the form. When I type in my URL, so say it's amazon.com, it's going to check if the form is valid. It's going to clean it. Then it's going to decode it into a lowercase. We'll talk about the messaging in a second when we get there. And then it basically renders in a form.html, which we'll go through as well. I just wanted to help you understand the logic of how this works, and I think doing that pictorial, and helping you understand this code is a good first start. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because that leads me into my next topic, which is the data storage with SQLite. So as I talked to you guys earlier when we were creating our models, remember when we're looking at our database, we need to create some kind of an ID, which will automatically create itself. I don't need to worry about that. We need to create a URL ID, which is that text or that integer number based on some kind of a URL, and then the URL shortener path or endpoint or whatever you want to call it in this case. And so really we need to figure out how we're going to go ahead and store these into my SQLite database. And when you're using Django, it has actually something called ORM, or better known as object relational mapping. And that is basically, you're going to be using an object to map articles to it. And so in order for us to set that up, we have to go ahead and create the models.py. And the models.py is what's going to define how we're going to set these items up. So let's quickly go through an example. So the first thing we're going to do, let me get rid of this, is you're going to go ahead and you're going to create a class. And in that class, we're going to call it, let's call it URL data. And we're going to pass in models.model, which is a method of this class basically. And so now I'm going to go ahead and say, remember we wanted to store URL ID, and I'm going to say that is going to be, now here's where I'm going to define what I want it to be. So I'm going to say that I want it to be a char field, and we're going to give it a max length. So this is every single time you're doing this, you're putting in a char field, you have to define a max length. I'm just going to say, I don't know, 10,000 in case it's a really big URL, or maybe we'll just constrain it to 1,000 for now. And then the second thing I want to be able to store is something called a short URL, which is that little short endpoint that I was talking about, models dot, and it's basically going to be the exact same thing, and we'll say max length equals, I don't know, 12 or something like that. And then we're going to basically create underscore, and this is every single time I call this method, it's going to return these items for me. Now I want to be able to return both of these items, so I'm going to create something called a template. So we're going to do template is equal to dot URL ID, and then the second thing I wanted to return for me is the short URL. And then I want to return the template in this format. And what this is going to do now is this is going to return both values for me in this method that I've got it set up. So it's going to return both the URL ID and the short ID when I need to pull it. Sometimes people will just put in things like self.URL ID because that's the only thing they want to reference to. For me, I need to reference to both, so I have decided to do it this way. And that is basically your models.py. So all we're saying is every single time we're going to write something to the database, write it as a text field, no more than 1,000 characters. The short URL, write it as a text field, again, no more than 12 characters in this case. Maybe for consistency, we'll just leave both at 1,000. We'll just leave it at that. And that is your models file. So every single time I'm going to retrieve data from this, I'm going to use something called a query set, but we'll get into that later on. So now that we have our database set up because we know how we want it to look like, and we've talked about the views.py file, and again, I'm putting this all up on GitHub so you guys can go through it in detail. If you have any specific questions, shoot me up in the comments and we can talk about it. But for the most part, we'll get through this very shortly, and I'll explain some of the missing stuff here in a few seconds. But let's go ahead to the urls.py for the application. So if I go to the urls.py, there's a few things that I want it to do. First and foremost, I don't need this admin path, so I'm going to get rid of this, and we're going to type in shorten. So every single time they go to the website and they type in shorten, I want it to go to views.getForm, and I'll explain this in a second, and we'll say name is equal to the URL form. So what this means is every single time I go to my URL /shorten, I'm telling it to go to views.getForm. And when I go to views, that's basically saying go and to this function, getForm. And what it's saying is the user is going to enter something. It's going to be a post request. And if it is a post request, then go ahead and get that ID or that information, that URL that they put in. And then we want to go ahead and encode it. And that's what this is saying. So once I get my URL, let's say it gives me number 123. Messages is something that I use in my HTML file to basically give one of these two messages, either record already exists or congratulations, based on whether or not an ID was found or not. So that's all that messages does, and we'll walk through that when we get into the HTML code. But then what it's doing along while it's actually checking for the ID, this is where it's actually putting it also into the database. So if the record already exists, and if that item already exists, what you're going to do is we're going to use something called a query set. And I know I'm sort of drifting a little bit away from our lesson plan, but a query set basically will take that object, in this case it's the models.py, and what I'm saying in this case, because this is called URLs data, right? So if I go back here to views and I query URLs data and I look at all the objects in it, I'm saying first of all, in this little block of code here, go ahead and pull everything. I can get rid of this. I have two variables here to find, but it's saying go ahead and pull everything in this case. Then after I pulled everything, so this is almost like saying select star from table. That's basically what this is saying if you're to convert it to SQL terms. And now this filter is almost like saying the where command, but I want to filter where that string ID is equal to the ID that was put in based on the URL that I was asked to convert to. And once I have that URL, get the short URL, and then we're going to display it. We're going to say the service URL, which is up here, / a short URL. So all I'm doing is if I were to simplify this, is if the ID exists, I'm pulling the short URL and displaying that here, and that's what record exists does. On the other hand, if the URL doesn't exist, then what I'm saying is go ahead and take that URL ID, which we defined over here. Otherwise, take the ID that doesn't exist, we've already looked at it. Take the short URL that I generated, and that's basically, remember, creating that random string over here. That's what this SC is equal to. And we're going to save that into URL data. And that's how simple it is. This is very much like saying it's insert into table ID equals, whatever, and then short URL equals whatever. And you just hit u.save, and then your message, congratulations, and then you put your information here. And this is basically the beauty of Django using ORM to write to a database. It is so much more simpler. I don't have to sit there and worry about insert, select statements, and all that other stuff. I can do it this way, and that's the way ORM works, basically. Now, there's one other piece of information that we need to go through, and that is a serializer. So every single time a user puts information into a website, that website is going to convert that information and send it to Django one way or another. And what a serializer helps you do is it helps you put it into a JSON type file so that it can actually be readable by Django. And what you'll notice up here is I've actually defined a serializer class, which is URL data serializers. Now, I haven't created my serializers file yet. I'm going to do that. I'm also going to link another video above, which is going to talk about serializers in a previous Django video that I did that you guys can read up on as well. But let's go in here and let's create a new file, and we'll call it serializers.py. Okay, so now when I go ahead and look at this, I have a serializers.py in here, and that's what I want. And so here we're going to say from rest _ framework import serializers, and then from models import URL data. And remember, URL data is our database. Okay, so now we're just going to write class, and this is typical convention, URL data serializers, and we're going to type in serializers dot, and I'm going to use something called a model serializer. Now, if you go on the documentation, there's different types of serializers you can use. Model serializers is one of the most common ones that people use, so it's probably what you want to use. And we got to create some metadata around this. Model equals URL data, and then fields that we want to serialize. I only have one, but I will just use all because I always want to serialize all my fields. And that's it. So it's saying every single time I'm taking data in from this, I need to make sure that I've serialized it, put it in a JSON file, and that's what Serializers does, basically. Now, the last thing we haven't talked about yet is the actual HTML rendering. So a lot of the code, the backend code for Django is done. If we were to go ahead and just review this very quickly, I have a project file. In the project file, we went and we installed this application in settings. In URL, every single time I go to every time I just go to the regular website without putting anything, it's going to direct me right to the application because it's the only application I have. Otherwise, I would type in something like, something relevant to the app, but you can do something like app 1, app 2, app 3, or whatever it may be if you have multiple applications. Because we only have one, I'm leaving it like this. And then once it goes to shorteners.url, which is right there, and we type in /shorten, it's going to go to the views, which is going to go ahead now, and if I go to views, it's going to get information from this URL, which is basically our form. It's going to go ahead and serialize any information that comes in it, convert it into a JSON type file, and then it's going to put it into the database, and that's what this is doing. And so if I were to just quickly to go and review our database, if I were to go to here, what you'll notice, nothing's actually here. And there's a reason why. Like I said, every single time you change your folder, you always have to run migrations. So we're going to go ahead and type in Python. First, let me make sure I'm in the right directory. Where manage.py is, I'm not. So let's go back out. I'm going to type in Python. And this is probably something you want to do often. Just to get into to make sure you're fully updated. You're going to type in make migrations, and this is where it's going to give you some information. So it says model not defined, and we're going to go see exactly what happened here, and that's because that needs to say models. So good error check in here as well, which is great. So in my views.py, I just realized that there's a few things because I don't have my form set up yet, which we're going to go through in a second. I'm going to blank this out. And then the second thing I just realized right now is you'll see that in REST framework there's no serial, so this should just say serializer. So the reason why I had to do this, there's another py file that we're going to create in a second. So in my views, I just had to comment out forms because that's a py file we're going to create. And then when I go to my serializers, it's actually not called model serializers, it's called model serializer. So let's see if this lets me make migrations now. Okay, so I'm able to make migrations, and then what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to type in manage.py migrate. And of course, when we have our views, we also have to import views as well. So we're going to say from import views. Now there's a few other things we're going to have to do to this specific file, but we don't need all this stuff over here. So I'm going to get rid of all this. That's pretty much all we need. There's also a few more things that we're going to have to import as well, but I will walk through that. You know what? The next one I will walk through right now. And that is, so when I go to shorten, it's going to take me to the get form. But now I'm going to put in here what we call a wildcard. And this is where basically if they were to go ahead and put in their short URL ID, so the / ABCD or whatever we talked about before, that needs to go somewhere. And that's going to go into my redirect function over here. So that is going to go here. So that request is going to come here, that service URL plus whatever that shortened thing they're putting in, and that's what the short URL is going to be. And then this is where it's going to go ahead and do the base encoding and convert it back into a full URL. So, but we need to tell the URL's py for it to do that. So we're going to go to views.redirect short URL. Redirect _short _URL, and we'll just call this redirect function or something like that. Okay, there's a few more things we're going to add to this afterwards, and that's just personal preference, but we'll talk about that later on. So now let's go ahead and try to build any migrations. So I'm going to go Python manage.py make migrations, and I misspelt that, obviously, redirected. So we're going to say redirect. Let's try that out. So there's no changes detected, but I just do this anyways, and then I type in migrate. No migrations to apply, so we're good to go. So that means everything in the database is up to date, it's good to go. So now let's run the server and see where we're at with all this stuff. So we're gonna type in run server at port 8000. Let's bring this URL up and see what is up. So let me just pull it up here and you'll see this. And this is, it's good it's showing us this, because right now it doesn't know a lot of this stuff. So what it's doing is it's going to, I went to the website, which is this. So it's going to go to the urls.py folder, which is right here. I haven't told it to go to admin. So it's saying, okay, well, I tried admin, that didn't work. Now you'll notice it's saying, well, I've tried shorten URL and short URL. Well, that's not sitting here. So what it's done is after it tried admin, it went to short URLs, which is under the application. And you'll see those two are actually over here. And that is the order that it actually went in. Now, if I were to go ahead and right now there's nothing at shorten because we haven't created our file for that. So right now you're going to get nothing because I don't have a forms field file for that. But what I want to do is every single time I go to localhost 8000, I want it to automatically just go to /shorten. I don't want to have to, type that in. So in order for us to do that, it's actually quite simple. You can do something called a redirect view. And that's the last one that I'm going to add here. And so we're going to go ahead here and type from Django.views.generic import redirect view. And then all I'm going to do here now is I'm going to say path. And now I'm going to say if I don't have anything, like if I don't have any / or anything, send it somewhere. And I'm going to say redirect view dot as _ view. And this is all in the docs, guys. You can read it. URL equals shorten. And so all I'm telling it to do now is when nothing happens, when nothing's there, send it to shorten, which is right here. And that's going to go to the URL form. So let's give that a try. So when I go to the main file, it should actually lead me onto this dead page here, which is nothing. So we are going to shut this down and we're going to restart it. And I'm just going to copy and paste this, and this should automatically forward us to shorten. Let's see if that works, which it does. So that's what I want. I want it to automatically take me to the HTML file. So in terms of building the backend now for a lot of the Django stuff, it's been done. We have to now start working on the front end, and that is what the next part is going to be about. All right, now for this, because I've already developed a lot of this stuff, I'm not going to redevelop it. It's just a lot of work. I'm going to walk through the code and we are going to go through it together, and I'll help you understand what's been done. So it's in this folder, which I've called something else. This is the one I'm going to put on GitHub because it's the original one and you guys can follow it. And I just realized the naming convention is a little bit easier. This is project, this is app, so it's easy to remember. And so I'm going to go into the application. I'm going to copy over a couple of files. So shortener, applications, I'm going to copy over template, static, and we're going to copy over form. Okay, so let's just bring those over here into our new file, and we're going to see what that does in just a minute. So when I go to forms.py, let's open this up. In forms.py, I basically said from Django import forms. In this, all we're doing is we're taking the input field, in this case, remember, is actually going to be the URL, or it's going to be the front page that we have where we said enter your shortened text. And that's all that is. It's just one file. We're not storing this information anywhere. Remember, we're storing the conversion of this as an integer somewhere. But this is where you would put in http.amazon.com. So I said enter your URL, max length 1000. And I just said as a placeholder, we're going to put shorten URL here, and we'll review that again in a second. But a placeholder is basically when I have my text field, it has that information pre-populated in it. That's all shorten URL is doing in this case. And that's all we're doing with Django Forms, is we're just creating the one input, and then we're telling it what's happening with it. That's it. So that's it for forms. Now, all of your Django HTML stuff is stored in a file called templates. Okay, so in templates, I have my form, then I have my form.html. Now, this is some involved code which we'll go through. It has some Jinja in here as well. And then just to let you know, static is actually where we're going to have all of our images, Django, logo, Python, and all that other stuff. So that's what static is for. And we're going to have to make a few modifications to our settings, but I'll do that after. First, let's go through the forms.file here. All right, so from the forms file here, let's just go through this very quickly. I'm basically bringing in the bootstrap piece of it. I've called my title URL Shortener. If you follow the way bootstrap works, it works based on columns and rows. And I'm not going to go through that because that's a lot to go through. But basically what I've done here is I've set up the sign up and login functionality, which you guys have seen. We'll walk through that again. The little dummy stuff that I had above. And remember, I only have one working URL, which takes you back to the home page. And then over here, I have my logo and a few other things. But let's scroll down to the meat and potatoes of this. And that is really this place here. The block content moving down here. Here's the way this works. You're always going to add in a CSRF token, but now I'm going to type in form.enter URL, and what that is going to do, I go to forms, enter URL, that's going to bring up this text box, and that's what it's doing. After it brings up that text box, where did it go? Right here. This is all bootstrap convention. So I'm using a class which is button success text center. That is a bootstrap thing, and again, you can read about more of that on bootstrap, but this is where it happens now. So it's saying if messages. So remember a while back I talked about messages, and those messages were sitting in views.py, which were right here. These two are my messages. Okay, either record exists or congratulations. So if I go back here and I go to forms, it says if there's a message that exists, which is going to be one or the other. For message and messages, so look at all the messages in my messages queue, and basically print out whatever message of the two that is going to appear. Now, unlike my previous video where the logic of whether or not the message is displayed, which message is displayed, that was determined in the actual HTML file. And it's not the HTML file that's determining which message to display, it's the Python file. So if I go back to views, this is where the logic is built, this if-else statement. All it's doing is it's returning some kind of a message. So this form is now picking up the message, and it's saying whatever that message was, whatever you returned, as long as there's a message that exists, display it. And that's all it's doing. And then the actual formatting of, making it look pretty and all that stuff, that is just regular bootstrap that you can go ahead and look. And like I said, this is going to be up on GitHub for you to look at. Now, the other thing I want to walk through is the actual images. When you're loading images in Bootstrap, you always have to start off with this tag called load static, and your images are always going to sit in a static folder. And in order to get all of that to work, remember I said we need to go back to our settings.py and we need to make a few small minor changes. Okay, so the first of all is we need to add a media root, and this you only need in development. You do not need this in production. In production, you can do it the regular old convention way. You just type in url.path join baster, and this is I would say cookie cutter code as well. Nothing innovative or nothing special here. As long as you put this in, you're going to be fine. And then media underscore URL is equal to /media. The other thing you're going to need, which depending on which version of Django you've got, is you're also going to need to have this line here, static URL. It looks like in some of the later versions they've automatically included it. I believe in some of the earlier ones they did not have it. And then the last thing you need to go ahead and install is in the applications. Let's go back up to applications. Remember we added in Bootstrap 4, so we need to go ahead and install Bootstrap 4, and we need to add in Crispy Forms. So if you remember when we first did some of our installations of some of the applications some of the dependencies, Crispy Forms and Bootstrap were some of the ones that we had to put in. And then the last thing is Bootstrap comes with Crispy Forms comes with a template pack, and we have to install that as well. So crispy underscore template underscore pack is equal to bootstrap 4, and that's it. And that should be pretty much it for your settings file. So now you've installed your shortener application, you've told it to use bootstrap, and you've told it to use all the Crispy Forms assets that are in there as well. You've also gone ahead and installed this media path as well as the static piece here, which is going to now allow you to import images into a development environment. So let's go ahead and try to run this. I think that almost summarizes everything, but let's see if we can run this with some success. But before that, as always, I always try to make migrations in case there's anything. So Python manage.py. And the good thing about make migrations is it'll also tell you if there's any errors, which in this case there is. And I didn't spell join properly somewhere, which is probably not here, right there. So let's correct that. Go back up here. No changes, but I'm still going to do Python manage.py migrate. It's just a habit of mine. I do it. You don't have to do it. It's up to you, but I choose to do it. All right, so my service URL, just so I can go back and double check, is set up at port 8002, so that's where I'm going to run this now. We can change that to 8000 actually. Let's just change it. So we're going to go to run server port 8000. Okay, so now I'm going to run this. Let's bring this over here. Now this should directly go to shorten, and for some reason it has not, and let's just check, and that is because it's missing the / in front of it. So it works now. That means that when I actually have my code, I need to go ahead and add a / over here and a / over here, and now it will work. So let's go ahead and close this down, and we're going to go ahead and rerun this all over again. And let's see if it actually takes me directly to shorten. So let's give this a shot. And so it does. So now it works, and that's just because we were missing those /. So that does that. All right, so now with that, we got this working. We're going to give this a shot. So we're going to type in http /, we'll type in apple.com. Apple already exists. So just let's go ahead and double check this. Now remember, it says 7HA, so let's just look at this ID up very quickly. I'm going to bring up the database, and we're going to run this in parallel, so you'll actually see some of the entries come in as we're typing in new entries. So when I go to the database here, it's showing that URL, which is likely apple.com, so that's the same URL that's there. We're going to go ahead and put this in a new tab and run this anyways. So it takes us to apple.com. So we know that's the only entry in the database. Now, if I were to go ahead and type in, let's do amazon.com. And so now it says, congratulations, a new URL. Before we visit this, let's just take a look at this quick endpoint here. So VFO, if I go back to the database here, let's refresh this. You'll notice that a new entry has been written in here. And so when I go back and run this, this takes me to amazon.com, which is perfect. And we're going to run one more, and we'll do Samsung. So HTTP, and then we'll do samsung.com. And when I go back to the database again and I hit refresh, you notice it's D4H, which is the same thing over there. And that just basically means that it's been written to the database. And we'll test that one more time just so you guys see what I'm talking about. Takes you to samsung.com. So that's how that works. So if we were to go back here and type in samsung.com again, it should say record or exists because it's sitting in the database, and you'll notice that it has not created another entry because it's already written. And this is what I was saying, that this is only going to get created once. It's not going to get created multiple times because there's only one ID. So that is basically how this works. It took me about an hour or so to build the logic in the background, and maybe another 45 minutes to an hour to put this together, this front end. You know, as you can see, front end is not my forte, but really you can design this to whatever you want. You can make this look a lot more modern based on what some of the templates look like today. or you can take pre-existing templates and modify them and just add an application in there, especially if you're using something like Django. So that is how you use this. If you guys like this and you found this helpful, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.